Hello, it's LeaX again, and as of writing the script for this review, I just got back from seeing Les Miserables, the movie adaptation of the popular stage musical, which was in turn based on the novel by Victor Hugo, and starring Hugh Jackman as Jean Valjean, Russell Crowe as Inspector Javert, Anne Hathaway as Fantine, Amanda Seyfried as Cosette, Eddie Redmayne as Marius Pontmercy, Sarah Barks as Eponine, and Sacha Baron Cohen and Helena Bonham Carter as the Thénardiers. Now, just 2 days prior to the release of this film, I saw the original show for the first time in DC, but I won't give you my opinion on it now until I get to the actual review. But just so everyone knows, I will not just be judging this film as an adaptation, but also as a standalone film, as that's what I think all adaptations should be able to do. With that said, here's the review that I wrote while still jittery from the caffeine I drank to stay awake the whole time. For those unfamiliar with the basic story of Les Mis, let me fill you in. The story begins in 1815 and ends in 1832, whilst the French Revolution goes on in the backdrop. In the prologue, we learn of a man named Jean Valjean, who was imprisoned 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. While on parole, he steals silver from a bishop that took him in, but is let off the hook and from then on decides to completely restart his life and become a better man. Later in time, he runs into a young woman named Fantine who's desperately trying to support her illegitimate child. When she dies, he offers to take her child, Cosette, into his care. However, his true identity has been discovered by Inspector Javert after Valjean reveals himself as the trial of a falsely accused man. Since Valjean broke his parole, Javert sets out after him, as he believes that those who've done wrong should always pay the price. Later in time, we're introduced to a group of schoolboys who set up a rebellion at the barricades. One young man, Marius, winds up falling in love with the now-grown Cosette, much to the dismay of Eponine, the only child of the filthy innkeepers that originally fostered Cosette. From then on, things get very bloody, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't bawl my eyes out at the end. As you may have guessed from my rather long summary, the story itself is rather complex, with many intertwining plot lines. They all seem to share a common theme. They show us how even the innocent can be guilty at times. The dynamic between Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert is actually quite fascinating, as one feels that everyone deserves a second chance, including himself, and the other believes that if you screwed up, or supposedly screwed up, you should be shown little to no remorse. It's a rather intriguing story that has all the makings of a great film. The people behind this also set it up for greatness. Not only do we have this great all-star cast, but a director who, in the past, made a Best Picture winner, The King's Speech, which is the film I rather liked. It also helps that they have the original people behind the musical write the screenplay and even produce it in the case of Cameron Mackintosh. But does this movie work on its own? Well, even though it hardly ever deviates from the source material, it still tells the story in its own compelling way. One of the things that this movie gained recognition for was the fact that all the actors sang live like you would when singing on stage, and, oh boy, does this work to the movie's advantage. These people aren't just singing, they're pouring all this emotion into it. You can really see it in the actors' faces, making it seem even more believable. It's kind of ironic considering 95% of the dialogue is told through song. And this is one of the characteristics that made Les Mis unique as a musical. It wasn't just characters randomly breaking out in song. The story was told through the music. Really, the movie just wouldn't have worked if the singing was more rehearsed. Every actor in this musical needs to be able to convey emotions through these songs, and Tom Hooper's direction made it possible for them to give their own unique touches to it. Speaking of Tom Hooper, this man put a lot of time and effort in shooting this. He used some of the same techniques that he used in The King's Speech. For example, there would sometimes be angles in which a character is off-center to give a sense of depth to the setting. Other times, he'd keep the camera focused on one particular shot for several minutes to really show us the actor's expressions. These techniques complement the live singing done and really got me into this film in an emotional sense. By the end, I had tears in my eyes. It affected me that much. I can already tell that Hooper will definitely get nominated for Best Director, and most likely will be taking home that Oscar. Which brings me to one of the movie's best points, the acting. As previously stated, the people involved were given much more freedom in front of the camera, and when they're good, they're fantastic. I know it's been said by everyone who's reviewed this movie, but Hugh Jackman and Anne Hathaway turn in phenomenal performances as their respected characters. Hathaway had my mom crying as soon as she appeared on screen. She didn't even have to say anything. So she not only brought out all these strong emotions as she sung, but she actually made herself look like she was wasting away. I always have to applaud actors who go to such lengths. As for Jackman, he brought so many layers to Jean Valjean. He was stern, he was compassionate, he was conflicted, he was angry, he was lonely. Need I go on? Throughout the whole thing, I was like, if this guy doesn't at least get nominated, I swear. As for everyone else, the acting is quite solid all around. Russell Crowe plays Javert with very little emotion, even at his most vulnerable. I heard a lot of people complain about his singing, but I personally wasn't bothered by it that much. Sure, he's not the best singer ever, and he's definitely not the best Javert ever, but the performance he gave fit with the personality of his character. And, before some of you ask, I thought he pulled off that voice far better than Pierce Brosnan did in Mamma Mia. Then there was Sacha Baron Cohen, who turned in a great performance as Thénardier. He played that type of character in many other movies, so it's not unexpected that he'd do well. Same can be said for Helena Bonham Carter as his wife. Amanda Seyfried is good as Cosette, despite having very few appearances. Sarah Barks has played Eponine in the past, so she knows the character and does it well. Eddie Redmayne, though he did come across as a little odd at times, does a good job as Marius, and he was a hell of a lot better than the one I saw live. I won't say too much about the music, but these songs are instantly recognizable regardless of whether or not you're a musical fan. I'm sure everyone by now knows I Dreamed a Dream and On My Own, but that's only a fraction of what this musical has to offer. Stars, Castle on a Cloud, Empty Chairs at Empty Tables, One Day More, Do You Hear the People Sing, Red and Black, I could go on. I also do love how a lot of the songs have similar melodies, which has to do with the story being told through song. It's a minor thing, yet it works so well. With all my long ramblings about how good it was, do I think this is a perfect movie? Yes and no. You see, most of my problems come from stuff that bugged me in the original musical and stuff that I know will turn some people away. For one, while Seyfried and Redmayne are fine in their roles, I never really cared for the relationship between Cosette and Marius. Cosette doesn't really get much to do in the original musical. She gets a few moments every now and again, but to be honest, she's came across as more of a plot device, if anything. As for Marius, I always kind of found him to be kind of a jerk-ass in the beginning. He blindly goes after this one girl and completely ignores his friend in the process, even though she helped him get to do everything he needed to do. Granted, he does learn his lesson in the end, but his relationship with Cosette still felt rather flat to me. He just ran into her and snuck over to her house one night, and they instantly fell in love. This isn't the movie's fault, but rather the fault of the original musical, so it doesn't completely knock off any points. All that said, while this is a very, very good movie, I can see that this won't wind up appealing to a vast majority of people. The movie, as of now, currently holds a 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's understandable why that is. The singing never really stops, often directly transitioning into one song just as another ends, one big example being the transition from On My Own to One Day More. There are like 5 lines of dialogue spoken directly in this entire film. If you aren't a musical person, then I'd probably avoid this movie like the plague for the time being. And this isn't a very upbeat, feel-good type of musical. There are many plots going on all at once, and for some, that may be hard to follow. I can really see this being a big problem if you aren't already familiar with the source material. It also deals with the idea of human nature in a way that doesn't put anyone above the rest. Also, it can be downright brutal to watch. The people in the town are often very cold, ruthless, and rather unpleasant. Not to mention, most of the characters you get attached to wind up being killed off in the end, often in rather horrific ways. I mean, a little boy is shot on screen. This film may be limited by the PG-13 rating, but what they show isn't always very pretty, especially for a musical. On top of that, this film is rather lengthy, clocking in at over 2.5 hours long. People with any of the aforementioned gripes will not like sitting through this for almost 3 hours. And on a minor note, there was one scene that got a very unexpected response from the audience. You see, Jean Valjean, when he finds Cosette, he tells her everything's going to be okay and takes her in. The scene itself is rather straightforward, but some of the dialogue came across as rather creepy and hilarious. The biggest ones were, "What's your name?" and "Can you please show me where you live?" Many people in the audience were laughing at the scene, which I doubt was the original intent. This isn't the fault of the actors, but rather it was written in such a way that it comes across as unintentionally creepy. It's a minor thing, but it really changes the mood. In the end, the already great story and music of Les Mis was successfully brought to the big screen, thanks to Tom Hooper's direction and phenomenal acting, particularly from Hugh Jackman and Anne Hathaway. However, some, but not all of those who aren't musical fans or who go into it blindly without much background knowledge won't come out of the theater perfectly satisfied with what they just got. But I urge you to see it, as it really is a remarkable film in its own right. There's a reason it sold out, made me come home and get on a caffeine high, go to a later showing, and wind up having to wait in a line that stretched out towards the main entryway. Who would have thought this would have a bigger line than The Hobbit?